Good morning. I'm SunAh, and you're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. Every Monday morning, I'm joined by experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So grab that cup of coffee and get ready for a fun and insightful conversation. Where we live affects numerous aspects of our health and well-being by structuring who we interact with, our access to green spaces, education, and social services, just to name a few implications of space and place. Not only are we shaped by where we live, but where we live is also shaped by what's happening in the present, as well as what has happened in our space in the past. To tell us more about how the past shapes our current day experiences of where we live, I'm joined by Dr. Ash Woody. Dr. Woody is an assistant professor of African American Studies at California State University, Fullerton. They received their doctorate and master's degree in sociology at the University of Oregon. Dr. Woody also holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from California State University, Long Beach. Their research focuses on racism and resistance in U.S. society. Welcome, Dr. Woody. It is such a pleasure to have you here with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Laybourne. I really appreciate you reaching out, especially since I literally just finished this project and my dissertation just probably several months ago and then launched right into my new job. So it's really cool just to be able to talk about this in a space, that you've created here. That just seems so conversational, and it's nice to take a little bit of a break from academic writing.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So I'm so happy that you're here. And so listeners, you should know, I read Dr. Woody's article, which we're going to get into in just a moment, but I read their article. I absolutely loved it. My brain was like firing off with all these connections, especially thinking about Memphis and this idea of space and place and both the histories of a space and place and how they're still impacting us today. And so I was like, my listeners would love to hear more. And so I just reached out, and I'm so glad that you said yes. And here we are. And it's so amazing to hear that this project is really, kind of fresh, but also that you're willing to talk about it, because I know how some people feel about dissertation research. They're like, I just want to be done.
Yeah, it definitely can feel icky at times, especially having to revisit something that you've read over and over again, right? Where you read it so many times, it starts to lose its meaning. But, after putting this article out and just seeing people's enthusiasm about it, it kind of helped me become more enthusiastic about it and re-energize me in certain ways about it. So that's why I'm just glad to be here and talk about it with you and just share some of the key points and concepts that came out of this research.
Yes. Okay. So the article we keep referring to is in the journal Social Problems, and the title is Emotions and Ambient Racism in America's Whitest Big City. So just off the bat, you introduced this concept of ambient racism. So can you tell us what you mean by ambient racism?
Yeah, so that's a term that emerged from a lot of the interviews that I did with Portlanders of color. And, I didn't want to think about it as just like another new form of racism that I'm adding to the long list of the different kinds of racism that exist, right? So the way that I think about it is just, when we think about ambience, right? We think about it's like an ambiance. It's kind of all encompassing. It surrounds us. It's kind of omnipresent. And so the way I define it in my paper is just sort of this subtly isolating kind of exclusionary characteristics that are sort of baked into a place, whether that be the culture or baked into the built environment or just our daily interactions. And in the case of Portland, this is in a majority white context, though ambient racism certainly isn't limited to majority white demographic contexts. So when I frame it this way as kind of this ambient thing, right, a manifestation of feeling, right, that just a lot of people from marginalized groups and multiply marginalized groups may know this feeling where you might not be able to point to a specific person or a specific thing or a specific instance, but it's a feeling that emerges, or maybe a discomfort that can sometimes be hard to articulate And so this concept of ambient racism, I wanted to be able to articulate that, at least put a name to that feeling. This might look like, for women and feminine presenting people, like walking in public, for example, you might be anticipating violence. It may or may not happen, but, nothing bad may happen, but there's that mental work and mental load of anticipating the potential for violence. And that can be uncomfortable, but a lot of marginalized people and multiply marginalized people may normalize that discomfort. So in coming up with this, concept of ambient racism, I wanted to sort of put a name to that feeling. And in terms of race, this could also be, that feeling that a person of color might have when they walk into a room that's full of white people. It doesn't, no one may have to say anything or do anything that's overtly racist. Maybe they're staring, maybe there's like awkward smiling, but it's really just a feeling, right? Like the oxygen was sucked out of the room. And so that's kind of how I think about ambient racism. And this isn't something that I just made up. It really just emerges from what the people I interviewed told me.
I love this idea of first being able to name the thing, right? Because now we have a way to talk about an experience that is very common across folks from a variety of different marginalized social groups. So the naming process, having a concept, a term that we can then use and share across, right, as we're talking about these experiences. And one thing, I guess one reason why I was really excited when I read your paper was because it reminded me of when I was coming to Memphis for the job interview. I had spent the last 6 years in the Washington, D.C. area for grad school. And just the feeling when I got off the plane and was kind of in the city, which I am originally from Memphis, but just that feeling, it was a different feel, right? And I couldn't really explain it, but whereas DC, very racially and ethnically diverse, felt very affirming, I guess, in a way, coming back home to Memphis, it was actually kind of jarring in the sense of it felt a little less affirming and kind of a little bit like there was a heaviness over the city, which I think is very much tied to, if we think about MLK and his assassination here and really how that shaped the city in a lot of different ways. And as I read your paper, I was like, maybe this is kind of that ambient racism, right? This feeling that, again, is how I'm experiencing the city, but is also very much tied to past policies or legislation or past experiences of a city and that historical memory. And that's kind of what I was reading into your paper as well.
Yeah, history is really a big part of this. And like, what you're saying, just in relation to that feeling of literally just stepping off the plane and then kind of knowing or feeling that something's different is really a big part of it. And of course, like we, as sociologists, we know that those feelings might be connected to historical events, but not everybody, makes those connections, although they may have similar feelings, right? So I think, you mentioned like coming to a place sort of with fresh eyes, even though you had spent time in Memphis earlier in life, you were able to kind of see it again with fresh eyes. And that's what a lot of people that I interviewed said. Almost about half of the people I interviewed were transplants from different cities. So they were kind of able to go into Portland with a fresh set of eyes. They had experiences in other major cities that were much more diverse and comfortable to them. And so I had people who literally told me, similar to what you're saying, that there was just this sense of malaise. They described it as malaise, like a heaviness, as you described. And, one woman, she was a Black woman, actually from the South. So she had grown up in predominantly Black environments and in kind of her own, mostly Black community. And, she said that it just felt like there were ghosts or something. Like she couldn't really put her finger on what it was, but she had, was living in a neighborhood that was, had been gentrifying over the last couple of decades. So she knew that a loss had taken place, that there had been an erasure or a loss of Black community there. And that was something that she just felt, even though she didn't experience it firsthand as someone who had been displaced.
Mm-hmm. I think that's key, right? Even though she hadn't experienced it personally, right? She was still feeling kind of those aftershocks of this process that had happened. And so that makes me wonder, you know, how much of these different processes like gentrification are impacting people who, you know, may not have experienced the gentrification or may not have been displaced because of gentrification, but like you said, are moving into an area, maybe brand new from another city, how much that's impacting people's experience of the city, but also for folks who maybe grew up in the area and have seen these transitions happening, you know, how much that's impacting their experiences as well. Because I know you talked to some folks who, you know, were from the Portland area. And so how those experiences may have been similar or different.
Yeah, so again, I mean, while some of the newer transplants could sense and knew that there was this kind of long history of displacement, particularly in North and Northeast Portland, which used to be home to predominantly Black communities that aren't quite there anymore. I mean, the demographics have changed a lot in those neighborhoods in Portland and mostly been replaced with a, you know, mostly white kind of middle to upper middle income white population. And so a lot of the longtime Portland and Oregon residents talked about how, you know, because they grew up in that space, it was kind of normal, but at the same time, not comfortable. And so again, this kind of goes back to you know, how I think about ambient racism, which is kind of connected to the ways that marginalized groups may normalize discomfort. And so, you know, these longtime Portland residents were able to talk about that discomfort, but kind of kept going back to that's just kind of the way it was. Like, I kind of just got used to it. You know, my parents would talk about it. I would talk about it with my parents or maybe immediate community, but that was probably just, you know, it was usually just limited to that. But then there was, you know, the very material experience of displacement. You know, I talked to, you know, several people whose families were displaced from their neighborhoods and, you know, particularly Black individuals, you know, who had experienced a loss of community. So like, you know, the aunties down the street who would take care of you after school, you know, or people who would feed you, right? Neighbors who you could trust, and those kinds of community spaces and sort of community trust that may exist in, you know, immigrant or, you know, communities of color, right? Where those types of communities tend to emerge. And just feeling the loss of that was deeply emotional for people who were displaced and people that I interviewed who experienced it firsthand, either as children or as young adults.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our sense of community is so important and so integral to how we think about ourselves, and then also how, you know, experiencing a neighborhood or community, and those social ties are so key, which I mean, I think people are understanding even more over these past couple of years in the COVID-19 pandemic, just this importance of social ties and community in general. And so I think there's that connection to understanding how these experiences of displacement within a city are also impacting social ties and why that's important, right? Oftentimes, I think if we're taking the case of gentrification, people think about, oh, all, you know, benefits of gentrification in terms of the city kind of overall, a city's profile, but also thinking about what are the losses that are inherent in these processes of gentrification, both for individuals and different communities, but then also I think for the city as well, and losing some of that rich history that a city has. Now, since we kind of already jumped into some of the findings from your study, let's take a step back. And could you tell us a little bit more about the study itself? So listeners are probably gathering that you talked to folks in Portland. So could you tell us a little bit more about why Portland and some of the reasons why it's unique in thinking about this idea of ambient racism?
Yeah, I mean, and still connected to this topic of gentrification, I had actually initially set out to study gentrification. That was, you know, how dissertations change over time. You think you have a plan, but then, you know, that plan just doesn't pan out the way you had expected it. So that's kind of what happened with this project, where I set out to study gentrification in Portland. And after doing some initial interviews, everyone just started talking about racism.
Mm.
And so, I was like, I think this is becoming a project about racism. Of course, gentrification is closely tied to racism, but this seems to be about the experiences of communities of color in Portland. So, I came into this without a lot of familiarity with Portland. I'm from Southern California, like Los Angeles and Orange County area. So I come from a pretty racially diverse place where I didn't really experience what a lot of these individuals were experiencing on a daily basis, being in predominantly white spaces. So, I came in as somewhat of an outsider. I used some personal connections. I was able to, kind of put ads out there on social media, like, looking to interview people of color in Portland about their experiences. This could be the experiences of transplants or longtime residents. And, I was really, really impressed with just how much of a response I got. It really seemed like there were people who had been wanting to find a space to talk about this, because I don't think there are a lot of spaces in the community where folks might feel safe or comfortable talking about this. And so this is a primarily qualitative interview-based project. So I conducted around 50 interviews overall. And most of the interviews took place pre-pandemic. So I was actually in the city of Portland. We were actually able to meet up at a coffee shop, like let's grab coffee and actually talk in person, right?
Yes.
So that was really nice. But I did end up doing some interviews during the pandemic, kind of at the tail end of things. So it definitely is specific to a pre-pandemic Portland. And I don't know if you had, been paying any attention to Portland specific news at that time, but in the summer of 2020, the downtown area became kind of a mess. There were like, there were protests going on, like the city brought in the police and it was just very militarized. And so things got pretty chaotic for a while. And I think 2020 might have shifted perceptions of Portland in terms of it being sort of this liberal utopian place, because we had these images of like militarized police just, driving through downtown Portland. But anyways, yeah, this study just, started for me as a grad student in Oregon, trying to figure out where am I? There's something interesting going on here. I think, there's something to be said about the specific racial history of the state of Oregon, because we tend to think of Oregon in the Pacific Northwest as this kind of liberal utopia. And, when you actually look at voting patterns, it does skew liberal, and democratic, I guess, if you wanted to describe it that way. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the Pacific Northwest because it has a long history of racism that might seem more akin to the South, where, Black people weren't even allowed to live in the state of Oregon, until like the 1920s. And so there were some really strict Black exclusion laws. Asian Americans, along with other West Coast cities, and Asian immigrants were pretty much banned from, civic engagement, and they were, segregated in terms of housing and things like that. So at the same time, the Pacific Northwest and the state of Oregon specifically is like a hotbed for white supremacy. It's has a really large it had a really large Ku Klux Klan presence and participation throughout the years. And even today, it's home to white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys and a lot of kind of far-right nationalists. And so it's this kind of weird contradictory place where you have a lot of hippies, liberals, white supremacists. It's still a mostly white place, but it's supposed to be progressive. You have the TV show Portlandia that kind of portrays the city in this quirky way. It's sort of utopian and just kind of silly and fun. There's nature, hipsters, great coffee, right? Which is also true. There's just a lot going on in Portland. I thought this is such a strange and interesting place. And so I want to learn more, like what's going on here.
Yes. I think it's so important, everything that you laid out as we're talking about how kind of the past really informs the present. I mean, thinking about some of those exclusionary laws that were really shaping Oregon to be this white utopia. And even though we might think, oh, those laws are no longer in place, the effects of those laws we can still see, as you even talk about the racial demographics of Oregon or Portland specifically, still being very white space, right? And again, there's no current law that says, oh, folks of color can't move here or can't live here. But again, just that past legacy of policies that did say that are still very much shaping the experience of folks of color in Portland. And we're going to get more into exactly what you heard from your interviewees in just a second, but let's take a quick break. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm SunAh, and I'm here with Dr. Ash Woody, an assistant professor of African American Studies at California State University, Fullerton. And we've been talking about your paper in Social Problems, Emotions, and Ambient Racism in America's Whitest Big City, focusing on Portland. And before the break, you gave us some insights into why Portland and to how this study got started. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your respondents. I know you mentioned some of them, transplants, some folks, long time, folks in the community. But could you kind of tell us about both racial and ethnic background as well?
Yeah, so the racial and ethnic background of the people I interviewed for this study was pretty mixed. I would say it was about 25% Black identified folks, 25% Latinx identified folks, around 40% Asian and Asian American identified folks, and the remaining, being multiracial people and people who identify as Pacific Islander. And so in some ways it kind of represented the racial demographics of people of color in Portland, not very precisely, but I kind of tried to aim for that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these people, they skewed a bit young. So, ranging from 19 to 49 years old, but most of the people I interviewed were probably in their early 20s and mid 30s. Mm-hmm. And so I think in a way, that gave my respondents a very specific perspective on race, just from kind of a younger person's perspective, or somebody, somebody in college or someone who's younger and like moved to the city kind of fresh. Mm-hmm. And I think that also reflects like us as sociologists' tendency to interview people who are closer to our age, who seem a little bit more accessible, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I was a grad student in my 20s going, trying to connect with people in Portland, and that's just kind of how it ended up. But I do think there's something to be said about getting the perspectives of elders in the community, which was definitely missing in this project. And I think the perspective of elders could have really shaped the findings here. But I just kind of wanted to put that in there because it is a kind of age-specific group of people. Mm-hmm. And I would say most of the people I interviewed were college educated, either pursuing their degree in college or already held a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree. So these were people with some level of college education, which of course shaped the way that they talked about race. A lot of people had a level of race consciousness or like a language in which to talk about their racialized experiences that I think really shaped the findings here. But nonetheless, because of that, they were able to articulate these experiences in really deep ways that, I think are really valuable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so as you were talking to your respondents and listening to these, shared, what you found to be shared experiences, right, across your participants of these experiences of ambient racism, kind of what were some of the main themes that folks were reflecting upon in their experiences of Portland?
Yeah, I think, there were a lot of contradictory feelings that people had about Portland, especially transplants to Portland. So there's this kind of running joke that in Portland, everybody is nice. Like they'll let you merge on the highway. They'll ask you how your day went when you go to the grocery store, right? So as someone, if you're someone from New York or LA or some other major city like that, you're like, why are you talking to me? Why are you being so nice? Like, I'm a little suspicious of this, right? And so there's just this kind of permeating niceness there. And I think that was a little bit difficult for a lot of my respondents to reconcile with some of the experiences with racism that they were having in Portland. So, I had a respondent, she was multiracial, and she was commenting on how, everyone's so nice at the store, everyone lets you merge on the freeway, but then she goes and gets on public transport and then she gets harassed, right? For the, or, she goes to work and she's experiencing all these microaggressions from, white coworkers. And so there was sort of like this almost gaslighting happening where people were like, but everybody's so nice. Like, am I the crazy one to think that this just feels bad to me? Like, how do I make sense of this, right? Am I just being too sensitive? And so that's kind of where the concept of ambient racism emerged too, because again, these are individuals who are trying to make sense of these complex and seemingly contradictory experiences that they're having.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that idea of everyone's so nice, but also at the same time, they're not. And so trying to get a handle on, okay, well, what's really happening here? How did your respondents kind of make sense or even, I guess, cope with some of these experiences where you're kind of combating with this idea of this everyone's so nice, or even, media portrayals like Portlandia, right? But then your everyday experience is still, actual harassment or even just fear of violence, or those, just like you mentioned earlier, you walk into a space and you notice like it kind of goes quiet for a second, or everybody turns and looks. So how did your respondents, how did they kind of cope with that? What, did it change how they thought about Portland, or even thought about where they should be, kind of their place in the city?
Yeah, I had one respondent who I think came up with a really telling metaphor for this type of feeling or response to ambient racism. And she was on the younger side, I think in her early 20s. She was a Korean American woman. And, she said that this kind of feels like when you're in like a bar or a building and you know that the place is not earthquake proof. Like you look around and you know that this is definitely not structurally sound or like following regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So she said that's kind of how it feels to not be white in Portland. Like this place is full of mostly white people. And if anything happened to me, like harassment or discrimination or violence, I don't think I could count on anyone to help. At least that's how it felt to her, right? So she said, at least that's how it felt, right? Because we don't know for sure what would happen if something bad like that occurred. But just the feeling of like knowing there's a chance and I don't feel that anyone's going to support me or anybody's going to help me in this space. So I think that metaphor like really helped kind of articulate that feeling well. Again, like that anticipation, and that it's just like built into the infrastructure of the place. And it may not be coming from one person or one specific interaction, right? And so kind of in response, I mean, people do different things in response to this feeling, right? There were some people who described never wanting to leave their house and just kind of even before COVID, right? Just feeling more comfortable in a space that they could control. So after work, they just enjoyed going home to watch Netflix and hang out with their pets. And that was just, comforting for them. Mm-hmm. And ironically, with some of the interviews that I did during the pandemic, there were some people who said, this staying home has actually decreased my stress level. Wow. Because I can work from home. I'm not in these spaces all the time and under stress and feeling like I'm the only person of my race, on the fifth floor at my work of 80 employees, right? Mm-hmm. So, so there's that. And then there are individuals who, really went out of their way to build community and just to find like-minded people who were part of their racial group, who they felt they could connect to and share those experiences. So in a place like Portland, those community spaces and that type of community building becomes all that much more important because it's really not built into anything there. You really have to go and seek it out and find that community in order to just simply get your feelings validated.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a good point, thinking about where is there already a supportive structure in place where people can connect, or are people having to create these communities for themselves or potentially not even be able to, depending upon if they even see or interact with or come across other folks who they may be able to connect with in that way. And so it's really interesting when you shared that one respondent said, well, actually being at home because of the pandemic has decreased my stress. And I'm thinking about, wow, like how stressful must it have been for that respondent to feel like a global pandemic, right? And kind of this forced seclusion or isolation is actually better than having to navigate kind of the space of the city.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of that has to do with the sort of added load of emotional labor that a lot of respondents described, either doing that in their workplace or just in their everyday kind of space of navigating the city in public, or even intimate relationships as well, like dating. That was something that came up in a lot of interviews. So not having a large pool of people of their same race to date or people of color to date, and then just kind of having to be okay with like dating a white person, and all of the kind of complex issues that might come up with that. But yeah, like that is another thing I wanted to touch on too, is just the emotional labor aspect of it all. Like, for example, I had one participant, she's an immigrant from East Africa who had been living in the US for a little over 10 years and had been living in Portland for at least a few years at the time that I interviewed her. And she worked in public health, at a kind of a state building. And, she was one of two Black people on a floor of about 80 employees.
Wow.
And so, I asked her, what were your experiences, in that kind of workplace? And, she just said it was really, really strange. And because she wasn't socialized in the United States as, an African American, it was really jarring for her to kind of experience the way that, Black people are treated in this country. And so, she would say things like, people would be smiling at me for a little too long and I wouldn't smile back because it didn't feel good to me. But then those people would treat me poorly because I guess I didn't smile back at them. Mm-hmm. And so, she actually had to go to some of her African-American friends who had been socialized and grew up in this country, who were like, no, 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 no. If you're at work, like sometimes you do have to smile back if you want to keep that harmony, right? So she kind of had to be coached, by her Black friends who grew up here in this country, who said, hey, sometimes you have to smile back. You have to say nice words to the people in HR who make sure you get your paycheck on time, right? So those kinds of things. And I thought that was really telling because, even just, things that are minor, like smiling, the way you comport your body, the way you move through space, you're kind of having to survey yourself. And a lot of other scholars have talked about this too, like Arlie Hochschild and Dia Harvey-Wingfield has done really great work on this and like emotional labor in the workplace. And so I just thought, that specific case was really interesting, that she actually had to be coached by her Black friends, on how to navigate white space.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I mean, I think that example also shows kind of how a lot of these experiences can be, oh, that's just the way it is, right? If that's where you're from and kind of that's what you're quote unquote used to, you don't realize the extent to which ambient racism is shaping your experience of the world, but also impacting you, right? And so when you talked about that emotional labor, I'm also wondering, what is the cost, right? What are the effects of this ongoing emotional labor in the face of ambient racism? And I'm not sure how much your respondents were able to speak to that, or if they could even maybe identify. I know you talked about some people feeling really stressed and kind of that anxiety about going into public spaces, but I'm wondering if there are other ways that this was really affecting their health and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, it led to, a lot of mental health struggles for, some of the people that I interviewed. I mean, there were several people, who had talked about wanting to seek out therapists in the area. And, it can be really difficult finding a therapist who might understand the complexity of your experience if they're not, if they don't share that same experience. And so because Oregon's a mostly white place and Portland's a mostly white place, became really difficult for people to find mental health resources. I think on top of that too, I mean, there were people who talked about wanting to leave, I think especially when it comes to professionals of color in Portland, there's a pretty high turnover rate of people who get recruited and might work there for a couple years or a few years and then just can't do it anymore. So there were several people I talked to who said, I think I might be done. I might have to leave this place. I don't think it's worth, all of this trouble and labor, right? Extra labor that they're not getting paid for. And so, I think that's something that a lot of workplaces are going to have to reconcile because, of course, as you know, there's a lot of happy talk around diversity right now and recruiting the most, diverse employees, right? And kind of trying to live up to the virtues of diversity. But what happens when those individuals get to the place and then, just walking to the bus becomes a traumatizing experience or just an uncomfortable experience. So I think that's a kind of another result of all of the emotional labor and emotional work that gets put on communities of color and other multiply marginalized people in predominantly white spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, so important. The impact being that folks want to leave, right? Folks are looking for other spaces and places, whether it is, like you said, a workplace on the workplace level, or if it is even in a community, a city, a regional area, right? Trying to find other places and spaces that are going to be more comfortable, but also more inclusive beyond just kind of the happy talk and these kind of general conceptualizations or characterizations of a city as, a nice place or, as this kind of happy, hippie, good coffee place. Right. And so I think that's really important to be able to think about, okay, what are the outcomes for folks when they're experiencing this? And then how are we, or how will we change the environment and change these interactions as well, so that everyone can feel included and so that everyone is included as well.
Yeah, and that kind of became the latter chapter of my dissertation too, where, as you know, in sociology, we like to focus on a lot of the problems. We're really good at identifying the problems, getting real deep in the sad, depressing stuff. But, the last chapter of my dissertation dealt with resistance. And so, as our Lord and Savior, Patricia Hill Collins says, wherever there is power, there's an exercise of power, there is also resistance, right? By default. So, I tried to focus a lot on the things that people did in their everyday life to just kind of maintain their mental health, maintain their sense of self and not feel like they had to comport themselves in particular ways, right? And so, again, like I mentioned earlier, community building was really big. Even something as simple as like creating a yoga class that's just for people of color or just for queer people of color, because even the yoga class can be a contentious space. And so, there were people who talked about cooperative economics. So trying to lift up and build up the Black owned businesses and businesses owned by people of color, refugee and immigrant communities in Portland. So creating like a Black Restaurant Week or, making sure that money gets circulated within those communities was another big thing. And because I talked to, quite a few people who were professionals, they were college educated, some of them found themselves in jobs where they had a little bit of leverage to distribute money into the community in certain ways or, rub up against policymakers and politicians. There were quite a few people who were like, hey, I'm in this position of power. I can move money from the place that I'm at. So I'm going to use what agency I have here and make sure the money goes to communities that I care about or to causes that I care about, in a very material way, right? So that was really cool to see people just kind of using the place that they found themselves while, everyday interactions were difficult and it was stressful. there was still that sense of agency in terms of like, here's the power that I do have, and here's what I do have within my control, and the things that I can't change from where I sit.
Mm-hmm. That is so key. I'm very happy to hear, the resistance part, because as you mentioned, sociologists, we're good at the problems. And even I tell my undergrads all the time in class, I'm like, this class is going to depress you. Every single class period is going to get really depressing. And people want to know, right, where are the opportunities for resistance, for agency, and to change, right? And so I think even some of the things that you shared this morning are also things that we might think about in a city like Memphis, right? Some of these same types of initiatives are ongoing. And so I think that is one kind of promising area when we think about, okay, well, what can we do with what we have where we are in order to move forward? Well, let's take another break. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. And we're back here on Let's Grab Coffee. I'm SunAh, and I'm here with Dr. Ash Woody, an assistant professor of African American Studies at California State University, Fullerton. And we've been talking about your concept of ambient racism. And, as sociologists, we often are focusing on, structural racism or institutional racism. And I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how ambient racism expands or really adds to our understanding of the effects of structural racism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you said, in sociology, we're very much all about identifying processes and structures. We have a pretty good grasp of how structures operate to reproduce inequalities, right? Mm-hmm. And so with the concept of ambient racism, I wanted to create kind of a stronger conceptual bridge between structural racism and individual emotions. Mm-hmm. Right. So the idea is that ambient racism emerges from these deep structures and histories, that you talked about earlier, that we so meticulously study in sociology, right? But for racially marginalized groups and other marginalized groups, those structures may manifest in our everyday emotions, right? They're not just something we look at abstractly as a process. They're something that, affect us every day. So, really, I hope this concept can kind of bridge that gap so that we can see more clearly the connection between structural racism and individual emotions, kind of without reducing it to kind of maybe like a social psychological perspective, mm-hmm. right? That might just focus more on individuals, or things like implicit bias or microaggressions, which are all really useful concepts, but may also miss that more structural and historical component, right? Because behind every microaggression is some kind of historical or structural process, right? And so that's kind of the way that I think about ambient racism. And in a lot of ways, this concept drew a lot from, I don't know if you were at ASA in 2018 or heard Bonilla Silva's presidential address that year, but the theme was race and emotions. And, he said that sociologists should take emotions seriously, and that emotions should concern structuralists, right? Emotions are not just of concern for psychologists or social psychologists, that emotions are something that emerge from like the racialized social system, right? And so that's kind of the way that I think about it, and kind of hopefully this can help connect these sort of micro and meso and macro conceptions of racism that we have in sociology. And, hopefully it also just grounds it in lived experiences too, because sometimes the lived experience can get lost if we get too stuck in just talking structurally and about how structures operate. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, there's a lot more room to build and refine this concept, which I hope will happen if people read the article and want to, take the concept and run with it. But that's the way that I think about it.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought up Eduardo Bonilla Silva's presidential address and that focus, or that call to really focus on emotions, because as he outlined in his talk, but also as your respondents show, they're feeling racism, or they're feeling those vestiges of racist policies and practices even in the present. And so while, your respondents might not be able to point to a specific, piece of history or policy, they're feeling the effects of that. And they are feeling, they're feeling racism, right? And their emotions are telling them something about structure, about place, and about their place within a racialized social system. And so I think it's so key too, because people can relate to emotions, right? We're all feeling something, even if we can't necessarily name all of our emotions, but our emotions are a way that we connect with others, right? Through those shared emotions as well. So I think it kind of is a way for people to understand even some of the larger structural processes that we might talk about as sociologists, that might seem very complex or not easy to understand. Whereas emotions, that is something that I think most people can relate to in some way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you don't need a sociology or an ethnic studies degree to experience that type of emotion. Like my mom has probably experienced ambient racism, but she, might not have the language or, be able to articulate where that comes from. But like, that's, I think, a very shared experience for people. And again, like, I think this goes back to the just sort of naming, something that has been happening. Like I think Kimberly Crenshaw says, like, if you can't name a problem, then you can't see a problem. If you can't see the problem, then you definitely can't solve it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of how I think about this too, is just sort of naming something that, people have described for a long time. I mean, Du Bois talked about emotions in Souls of Black Folk, right? Like, how does it feel to be a problem? Mm-hmm. And so this, has been articulated by race scholars, and not just scholars, by everyday people for a really long time. So I kind of view my work as a sociologist to just kind of bring that into this space, but also honor all of the work and the theorizing and the intellectual work that people of color and other marginalized people have been doing for centuries.
Absolutely. So do you plan on using this concept of ambient racism in future research, or what are kind of your hopes for this line of inquiry?
I mean, like I said, I hope others can take the concept and make it their own and run with it. I'm kind of excited to see if anyone applies it to their own study, or even like in another place. Mm-hmm. Because as we talked about, Portland is very specific. This concept emerged from, the specificity of a predominantly white big city, but, it might be interesting to know what that looks like in a place like Memphis. Mm-hmm. Or in a place like Los Angeles, where I am, which is, huge, complex, messy, racially diverse, but also segregated, right? Like, mm-hmm. How can we apply that to a place like LA, right? This big monster. Because I don't think that majority demographic whiteness is a necessary criteria for ambient racism. I think, it's felt everywhere, but in different ways. Mm-hmm. So even in, a neighborhood here in the LA area that's being gentrified, while, in aggregate, LA is a very racially diverse place, there are particular neighborhoods in which that experience of loss of community is occurring, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. We also know that, even in communities that are predominantly communities of color or immigrant communities, racism and white supremacy can still be internalized, right? It's still operating within us. We might not even have to come into contact with white people on a daily basis to feel that. I mean, where I grew up, which is just south of Los Angeles in Orange County, right next to Little Saigon, which has one of the biggest Vietnamese American populations in the US. Whenever I go out to eat there, or I interact with some of my co-ethnic Vietnamese people, and aunties might be like, wow, I love your green eyes. Your green eyes are so beautiful, because I have a white dad with green eyes. They're like romanticizing my European features, right? And that has always happened, and that kind of runs deep, right? Mm-hmm. And yet these people may not even talk to a white person, for the entire week, right? Because everybody else is Vietnamese or Asian.
Right. I think that is an important part because I'm thinking now, in connecting to Eduardo Bonilla Silva's talk, right, when he's talking about you don't necessarily have to be having interracial interactions kind of in the present moment to still be feeling racism or feeling these different ideas that are governing kind of your behavior, and a comment like, oh, commenting on more Eurocentric features, right? And I think that is the point. We don't necessarily have to be having these experiences in the moment, but there are a lot of influences that are shaping even our interactions with co-ethnics as well.
Exactly.
So it sounds like you're moving on from ambient racism. That's what I'm getting from this, that you're ready for other researchers to apply this to cities with different histories and different present day demographics as well. So what is next for you, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, I definitely think I want to keep working with this concept. I don't have a specific project planned, but I definitely think it would be interesting to apply it to the place that I find myself now, which is LA, right? Yeah. And so especially, as I think about new projects and especially in this new position that I'm in, we have, a lot of freedom and flexibility to pursue the kind of projects that we really want to pursue. So I definitely would be thinking about that. But again, just, I can't get my mind off of the intersection of race and place, which ambient racism is very much connected to. So even thinking about, intergroup relationships here in Southern California, like this is a place where Asians and Asian Americans live in close proximity to like Latinx communities. What does that relationship look like, right? We have also a lot of I have this other interest kind of in beach spaces and like ocean adjacent spaces because we have, beautiful coastline here that only a certain, portion of the population gets to enjoy. And so, I think it could be really interesting to look into beach spaces. So even though Southern California is very racially diverse, you're mostly going to see white people surfing, swimming, doing all these recreation, beach activities. But there are still folks of color and queer people of color going out there surfing, swimming, playing volleyball, and taking up that space. And so I think looking at these particular spaces, even in a large metropolis like LA and Orange County, could be really interesting because in a way it's sort of maybe similar to Portland in the sense that they might be one of the few or one of the only, except it's sort of limited to just this like recreational space. So that's kind of something that's bouncing around in my mind right now is like recreational space, place, and experiences with race and racism.
Yes, so important because I think it just goes back to what you said. You can have different, smaller areas like a city or particular neighborhoods, but though the overall composition may be very racially and ethnically diverse, when we get down to that neighborhood level, we still see a lot of segregation, and then how that is governing experiences within the city, whether, in a downtown area, if I'm thinking about Memphis and how, race and place shapes the experiences of downtown, or in your case, the beach, right? And these recreational areas. So a lot of potential directions for future research. So I'll definitely be on the lookout for that. Well, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning. It has certainly been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Laybourne. It's really been great to just be in this space, and thank you for all the work you're doing just in terms of public sociology and getting ideas out there.
Thank you again to Dr. Ash Woody for joining us this morning and having a conversation about their paper, Emotions and Ambient Racism in America's Whitest Big City. Of course, here talking about Portland. As I mentioned earlier, when I read their paper in Social Problems, a journal, I was just really struck with the connections that I could see to our city, right? To Memphis, and thinking about the historical legacies that have shaped our city, both in who is here, in the layout of the city, in some of the different decisions, right, that our own lawmakers have made about the city as well. And I was just thinking about how all of that shapes our experience of the city today. And It's something I'm probably going to continue thinking about. And even contemporarily, we can think about our city's rich history. Thinking here particularly around music and what we embrace and what we don't really advertise as much as kind of our strengths in the city. So I'm so happy to know that Dr. Woody is thinking about expanding the research, but also hoping to see other scholars take up this concept of ambient racism and continue to add upon it and use it to examine other cities as well. Well, for today's positive note, I just want to leave you a quote by Nelson Mandela that says, "It always seems impossible until it's done." This has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm SunAh. I'm here every Monday at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. And if you missed any part of today's show, don't worry. You can catch the replay on WYXR.org. And all the shows are also archived in podcast format wherever you stream podcasts. I will see you back here next week.